Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our speaker, Nicholas Carbonell, who's partner at Bird and Bird, a law firm, and he will be talking to us today about ensuring ethical supply chains, on how to navigate the European Due Diligence Directive and the challenges of alternative ingredient sourcing as well. Nicholas?
Thank you very much, Natalia, and thanks for those who have made it so far to here. Thanks for attending. Didn't intend to, yeah. So yes, we will talk about a new piece of legislation in further detail, but we'll put it in perspective. We'll basically talk about sustainable supply chains, well, sustainability in supply chains, and how much regulation is coming in on that front. But before doing that, just a few words about myself and the firm. So I'm indeed a partner with the law firm Bird and Bird. We are an EU-based law firm. We are full service, but we are focused around certain sectors. One of those sectors being the retail and consumer sector, within which we differentiate food and beverage. I'm heading the food and beverage team on a global scale at the firm, and we deliver full legal services, my practice being regulatory. We have offices a little bit everywhere. As you can see, we have the US, which is highlighted, but we don't practice US law. We only have a representation office in San Francisco, but all of the other offices listed on this slide are offices where we have lawyers, local lawyers operating. But not too much about the firm as such. We are here to talk about ensuring ethical supply chains, and that's really, really a very hot topic at the moment, obviously. It's not new as such. It's been discussed. It's been around for quite a while. We do have guidelines from the OECD since 1976 already. They've been updated recently, but it's been a really key concern to make business basically more ethical on two levels, essentially, on the environmental level and on the human rights level. It's a very, very tough task to make that, and indeed it's very progressive. We have seen an evolution, so lots of recommendations, OECD, UN guiding principles on business and human rights that have been endorsed by the UN Human Rights Council. And then we have, of course, a number of labels that exist on fair trade, certified B Corp, and others that are mentioned on the slide. These are all, at least until now, voluntary instruments. So you have voluntary commitments. There are incentives on the markets to adhere to these principles and to implement those principles in your business. But so far, legislation has not made much of this mandatory. That means also that the effectivity of these principles has remained relatively low, and that is what the European Union has been tackling recently. This has not appeared in a complete vacuum. It appears in a context, and that context is the context of the European Green Deal, which is the policy agenda of the current Commission. As you may know, the current Commission is coming to the end of its mandate, but it has put in motion a number of initiatives, among which the initiative that we are going to talk about in more detail today. But the idea there is to make Europe greener, but also more ethical. And a number of legal initiatives have been planned. A number of these will not see the light before the end of the Commission. There have been a number of pushbacks on a number of initiatives, a number of difficulties, even on less controversial, well, initially less controversial topics such as front of pack nutrition labeling. These have been pushed back. I mentioned it because they were part of a comprehensive and relatively consistent package of making the European economy greener. And it's a bit of a pity that certain initiatives are going to be sidetracked and possibly postponed to a next Commission. It also frames into a relatively comprehensive framework. I mentioned already the UN guiding principles and the OECD guidelines. But of course, on this slide, I'm mentioning a number of EU initiatives that combine with the framework we are going to discuss today. So I mentioned the deforestation regulation you may be familiar with, the Sustainable Products Initiative, which is more around products sustainability criteria. It does not concern food, but it does concern, for instance, packaging. We have also the European Climate Law. We'll talk about the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive today, but it's very much related. It works in combination with another directive, which is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And we have, and we'll look into that in a minute as well, already a number of national law instruments that have been put in place on the same topic, which, as we will see, explains the complexities of the current situation. So, for instance, as I was mentioning, on an international level, we have a number of principles that have been put on paper on the basis of voluntary instruments. At European level, there is a willingness to regulate, but then in the meantime, before the EU regulated, or started to regulate, certain member states have taken initiatives. One of them is France. France is really well advanced in terms of sustainability legislation and mandatory requirements. And loi relative au devoir de vigilance has been enacted already. And I will not go into all details there, it doesn't matter too much, but it's important to understand that France has already put something in place that requires companies to perform some level of due diligence in terms of environmental and human rights impact of business activities. Of course, France has defined its own requirements, its own thresholds of applicability, and also its own system of liability and a requirement to compensate whenever damage is caused in light of this legislation. So because that already exists, that creates friction when it comes to developing a harmonized framework. Germany also has put something in place. It's only becoming applicable as we speak. I will not give the German name of that law. It's the German Supply Chain Act. It has a very, very nice name. My German colleagues love to pronounce it. I can't parrot it. It has the overall same purpose of strengthening human rights and environmental protection in global supply chains. It applies to companies in Germany. It applies to their own operations, but also to contractual partners' operations and direct and indirect suppliers. We will see that the logic is the same, nearly the same in the directive that is being put in place. The application, so as of this year, it applies to companies with over 3,000 employees in Germany, but the scope will be broadened to companies with 1,000 employees in Germany as of next year. So that brings this in context. There is also a Transparency Act in Norway. Norway is not an EU member state, but of course it's part of the EEA. It has a particular framework in place that also requires some disclosures about the environmental and human rights impact of businesses' activities. And so that brings us to the European ambition. So of course the European Green Deal has been in the making and in implementation since the Commission has been in place, but this is an extract from the well and longly commented State of the Union address, the latest one by President von der Leyen, because the criticism has grown that the European Green Deal was not really implemented and was not sufficiently well, not enough initiatives listed in the European Green Deal were being effectively put in place. So President von der Leyen has hinted at it and said that it was still pretty much the ambition of the Commission, but the address was not really specific as to the initiatives that would effectively be pursued. And in the meantime, we have learned that a number of initiatives, such as the Sustainable Food Systems Initiative, has been abandoned and will be deferred to a next Commission, if of course the next Commission picks it up. But so let's look still at this initiative, which is the initiative on corporate sustainability due diligence, because that was one of the cornerstones of the program of the Commission, and that one has been tabled, discussed, and is still set to be adopted unless things go wrong in the current phase of the trilogue. The point here, so the overall objective of this directive, and I will come back to that, it's a directive, is indeed to ensure that, or to frame better the behavior of companies across all sectors. So it's not specific to the food and beverage sector, it's not specific to the nutraceutical sectors, but it's very relevant for it because the food sector is being considered as a high impact sector from a sustainability perspective and from both on the environmental side and on the human rights side. And so the idea there is to set a binding framework requiring companies to perform some level of due diligence on the operations that they conduct themselves or that they have conducted along their supply chains. The purpose is to make the whole value chain more sustainable and more ethical in general. So the idea there, the picture there for the moment looks like this. So basically the initiative was published in 22. There have been readings by the Parliament, readings by the Council. Basically the Parliament came up with a report, a draft report in 2022 in November. Then a general approach was adopted by the EU Council. General approach is the negotiation position of the Council because, as you may or may not know, so Europe has different institutions. There are 3 legislators basically working together. So we have the Parliament, we have the Commission, and we have the Council being formed of representatives of the Member States. Whereas the Commission is made of, well, of course, politicians that are not specifically attached to a Member State, and the Parliament is made of directly elected members of Parliament. So you have different interests being represented by these various heads of the legislator. So the Council came with its negotiation position at the end of November last year, and then there have been opinions of the Parliament's committees, and the final report was released in May this year. The vote in Parliament took place in June, and so that means we know the position of the Council, we know the position of the Parliament, and of course we know the position of the Commission, which is the initial proposal. The overall objectives of the proposal for a directive is to improve corporate governance practices, to avoid fragmentation of due diligence requirements, because as we have seen, different member states were already taking initiatives on the same topic and of course resulting in potentially different approaches. On that note, some member states were intending to adopt similar frameworks but have, well, refrained from doing it pending this process. So this is the case for the Netherlands and for Belgium, for instance. The purpose is, of course, to increase corporate accountability for adverse impacts. We'll come back to what adverse impacts we are talking about. Improve access to remedies, because companies subject to the requirements under the directive will have to provide for a procedure allowing for a remedy in case someone has a complaint about an impact on the environment or human rights, and to complement the measures to those that are already in force. Key question, but unresolved so far, because this looks pretty much binding and pretty much set in stone. It's not the case, unfortunately. So, of course, personal scope. To which companies is this going to apply? Well, essentially, large companies, first of all, but not only EU companies, but also potentially non-EU companies. In the sense that the objective of the legislator is not to regulate only what's happening in Europe, but what's happening throughout the supply chains, but also what's happening by the fact of companies that are doing business in Europe but are not necessarily headquartered in Europe. So there is some kind of intended extraterritorial effect of this regulation, which is not a regulation, which is a directive, but these regulations in general. And the idea is to apply to large companies, but also to medium-sized companies. This is a contentious point, basically, because the Council is happy with the framework applying only to very large companies, whereas the Commission and the Parliament would like to have a scope that is broader. Also, the Council would like to set higher thresholds, whereas the Parliament would say it should cover basically more companies, smaller companies, and more sectors as well should be considered as high impact. As I mentioned in passing earlier, food and beverage sector is in any event considered a high impact sector. The Parliament made a few amendments to the initial proposal, and so that is the position of the Parliament. Removed the criteria of having at least 50% of turnover in a high impact sector, so basically the directive would apply to whichever company reaches a threshold of 250 employees on average and worldwide net turnover of 40 million euros. That's for the EU-based companies. And for, I put a US flag there, but it's valid for wherever in the world. So a turnover of at least 150 million and 40 million generated in the Union. So essentially a relatively easier scope defined by the Parliament, but also relatively broad. What type of obligations does this directive put in place? Well, quite a number. Basically, it requires the companies, well, maybe I pause for a second because, of course, the immediate relevance of this directive is for relatively large companies, as you would think, but still it's very relevant for the whole supply chain because these large companies will be required to put in place a number of requirements that we are going to go through now, but this will require the involvement and the active participation of the whole supply chain. So all of the operators along the supply chain will have obligations indirectly because of the commitments, the mandatory commitments of the large operator they are working with. So what do these obligations look like? Well, first there is an integration of due diligence in policies. So first of all, companies must have a due diligence policy in place, which is not necessarily the case. So it has to describe the company's approach to due diligence. It has to include a code of conduct and a description of the internal processes that allow the due diligence obligations to be met. So it's already relatively comprehensive and the requirement is relatively heavy, which is also why it is put mainly on larger operators that are capable of putting that in place. But even if it addresses primarily relatively large operators, it's still a very costly requirement that is being put in place. It's very ambitious, and of course it meets quite a bit of pushback, to be fair. Then, once these policies are in place, or in parallel to that, these operators are supposed to identify the potential adverse impacts of their operations on their environment and on human rights. There is, of course, a list of texts that are the main, that are supposed to be the main principles, guiding principles that should be observed. I say guiding principles on purpose because they pretty much match the UN and OECD principles. And the companies are required to perform due diligence over the whole supply chain and to identify where the activities of themselves or of the businesses they do business with could have an adverse impact. When they identify such adverse impact, they need to put in place measures to prevent or mitigate or end these adverse impacts. So that's the second step of the process. They need to monitor, of course, what is going on, so to assess periodically whether there are new adverse impacts or whether the things are evolving in the right direction. There is a communication element as well, but not to be confused with the reporting obligations under the other directive we talked about very briefly. So the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive is all about reporting, whereas this one is much more focused on due diligence as such. And then very importantly, having a complaints procedure in place. So to allow persons that think that a company is doing harm to the environment or is not operating in line with human rights, there should be a complaints procedure open, and that procedure needs to be put in place by the company itself. So, indeed, to which operations will this apply? This is also a contentious point between the Council and the Parliament. So the Council is talking about covering the chain of activities, meaning upstream, because that is considered as being under the control of the company. But in terms of downstream activities, the Council says, well, let's take a relatively cool and lax approach, and let's exclude what happens with the products themselves, so when the products are used, or whether services are provided in connection to the products. These should be out of scope. The Parliament says no, we should cover the whole value chain, upstream and downstream. This is one of the points that is being discussed in trilogue. It's not been decided upon yet. This is going into more detail about how to prevent, mitigate, and end adverse impacts. The main point here is to say that the companies that fall into the scope of the corporate stability due diligence requirements will need to review the operations of its business partners, but will have the duty to, well, map the potential adverse impact only in relation to established business relationships. So, because of course, if it's a one-off order from one random supplier due to the need, an urgent need to address, this will not fall within the due diligence requirements. But if it's an established business relationship, then you need to conduct all of the details and to put in place all of these measures to prevent adverse impacts or to bring them to an end. The idea being that if all of these measures being put in place do not lead to the adverse impacts disappearing or at least being mitigated as much as possible, then the company is supposed to bring the business relationship to an end. So really the ambition of the framework is really high. We'll see what it brings in practice, but the ambition is really to reshape the supply chains to make them much more ethical by, well, eliminating to the extent possible the business relationships that do not meet the standards set in the directive. Another very important part of this is, because it's all good and nice and to say, well, you should operate in environmentally sound and human rights sound way, but if there is no sanction, of course, it might be that certain companies will just overlook this or will consider that they have other things to address first. Well, that's why the idea here in this directive, to put it simply is to put in place a civil liability mechanism, which, and that is from a legal perspective, a very interesting point, but I will not go into too much detail there, also in the interest of time. The thing is, civil liability is not regulated the same way in all member states. So Europe is not a harmonized market when it comes to civil liability. We have different legal traditions in the different member states. So that's why it's needed to have a framework that defines a specific regime of civil liability that will be the same across all countries to avoid that, of course, cases, well, similar situations would lead to different consequences depending on the country where the infringement would take place. The thing is, again, the Council, so the representatives of the Member States, would like to have a relatively low level of liability and to avoid liability for business partners, except for intended or negligent breach of duties by the companies. But the Parliament has a much broader view on this. That's another point here, which is interesting. The directive provides, so the Commission proposal includes, on top of all of these due diligence requirements, it includes a requirement for the companies in scope to put in place a plan to ensure that the company will meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement on climate change. So that's an interesting add-on to the due diligence requirements. It's a complicated one as well. It requires a whole environmental assessment of the operations. Sadly, this is not supported by the Council, who says, well, and they probably have a fair point. They say, okay, the requirements under this due diligence proposal are quite extensive. They will already require quite an effort by the companies. It's probably a little bit too much to also include the requirements to have the companies explain how they are going to meet the maximum 1.5 degree objective. So that's why the Council, so it doesn't mean the Council doesn't support the Paris Agreement, it means the Council says it's a different problem and we should tackle it separately. Still, the Parliament is very supportive of this and has made a number of amendments to the initial proposal of the Commission on this particular point of the transition plan, and in fact has even defined in more detail what this transition plan should include. So it adds a little bit more of burden on the companies, but again, that's the position of the Parliament, and we'll see where it lands eventually. So what should companies do? And companies of all sizes. So not only the large companies that will be the main addressees of this legislation, but also the smaller ones who will be required to provide information by these larger companies, while of course monitor the developments around this legislation. The text is still in the making, as I explained, so it's still in trilogue. It's being negotiated between the different parts of the legislative arm of the European Union, but it's still set to become law under this Commission. So that means in the first part of next year. It will not become applicable immediately. It's a directive. It will need to be implemented by the member states. So we'll see as well whether there will be diverging approaches there. And the member states will have 2 years to implement the requirements. But still, it's never too early to start reviewing the activities and the supply chains to look at whether or not potentially adverse environmental and human rights impacts are present, to see whether how this will fit into the coming framework, and indeed to start thinking with suppliers whether anything can be tackled already. Of course, so there will be developments, so I suggest we stay in touch in relation to this, because it's a topic that will continue to evolve. If you scan this will lead you to a page where you can leave your contact details. At the same time, you will receive this presentation after the event. But indeed, the next development will be the Parliament's position in first reading, but we have no date to share today in relation to the next steps of the legislative process. Still, if you have questions, I'm very happy to take them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicolas. We do have time for a question if the audience has any questions. Yes, we do.
Thank you. I learned a lot. So not to discount the human rights and environmental, but I noticed you said something about the Sustainable Nutrition Directive as being sort of put aside for now. And I'm just wondering, especially as it relates to the UN's SDGs around human well-being, like nutrition's still in there somewhere. So can you speak more to what's happening and where it may go?
Well, yes, thank you for the question. As I mentioned, the European Green Deal, and in particular the Farm to Fork strategy of the Commission, included quite a number of initiatives that were meant to, essentially make the industry greener in many respects. And indeed, there were a number of initiatives, more around nutrition, more around labeling, so reviewing the labeling requirements, at last integrating nutrient profiles that are still missing from the EU regulatory framework, and that still are, in principle, a key element, for instance, in the framework on nutrition and health claims. So, in principle, all of this regulation relies on nutrient profiles that were to be defined by the European Commission. Hasn't been done in the past, has taken time. It was tabled for adoption under this Commission, but that will not happen due to the debates and the controversies around front-of-pack nutrition labeling. Next to that, there was also indeed an initiative that was well awaited on sustainable food systems, and that went actually in good combination with this framework that I described today, but unfortunately that will not become law. No, the draft was to be released earlier this year. It has first been postponed, and then it has been announced that it will not be released under this commission. But still, I mean, it's of course due to political reasons. There has been a number of elections at national level, and of course there is the upcoming European election as well. So that caters for, yes, probably a lack of momentum. There is of course the more global events that are affecting as well part of these initiatives, indirectly at least, and therefore the Commission is focusing on other topics, but these topics are so needed that I would doubt that the next Commission would not pick them up and resume work on that. But unfortunately, no groundbreaking evolutions to be expected in the next 6 months now.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. We have to wrap up. However, if you have any questions for Nicholas, he's here. We incentivize connecting with him. And just a reminder, if you're interested in Nicholas's slides, you're able to download from the app as well as any other slides from this theater. And thank you so much again. And thank you, Nicholas.